The courtroom had been tense from the moment the first lawyer stepped onto the polished oak floor that morning. The smell of coffee and paper mingled with the faint hint of disinfectant, the kind that always lingered in public buildings. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long, formal shadows across the rows of chairs where the jury had already begun to settle in. Reporters sat along the side benches, their laptops open, fingers poised over keyboards, waiting for the trial to begin. Cameras clicked and hummed quietly, capturing a scene that, on any other day, would seem mundane. Lawyers adjusting ties, a judge reviewing notes, and an officer standing stiffly by the courtroom door. But today, the air was tinged with something unusual, a sense that this trial would not unfold in the ordinary fashion. Judge Ramirez, a stern but fair woman in her late 50s, tapped her gavel lightly against the sound block. The room fell instantly silent. "We will now hear from a witness previously undisclosed," she announced, her voice echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged room. The statement alone was enough to draw attention. The courtroom leaned in instinctively, lawyers halting their whispered conversations, jurors sitting a little straighter. But then she added the part that caused actual murmurs of disbelief. "This witness is a toddler, 3 years old, Emma Collins." There was a stunned pause. For a moment the world seemed to tilt on its axis. A toddler, in a serious burglary trial. It was unheard of. Prosecutor Mark Hayes blinked, momentarily at a loss for words, while defense attorney Linda Carter's mouth twitched with what might have been a mix of curiosity and skepticism. The jurors exchanged puzzled glances. Who in their right mind would bring a 3-year-old to testify in court about anything as serious as criminal conduct? Then came the second shock. From the side door, a figure entered that nearly caused the reporters' cameras to tumble from their laps. It was Ranger, the police department's K9, a massive, intelligent-looking German shepherd with sleek black and tan fur. His ears pricked and his eyes swept the room calmly, tail swinging gently. But he did not move toward any officer or attorney. Instead, he padded over to a small, booster-equipped chair in the center of the courtroom, where a tiny, trembling figure waited. Emma Collins was barely 3, her brown curls bouncing slightly as she clutched a well-worn stuffed puppy in her arms. Her big, round eyes were wide with both fear and fascination. For a child her age, a courtroom full of strangers would have been overwhelming. The murmurs, the clicking of cameras, the stern faces of adults leaning forward, all of it could have made her want to flee. But she did not run. She stood quietly, a little hesitant, staring up at Ranger as he gently sat down beside her, head level with her own. There was a softness in his eyes, the kind reserved only for people he trusted, and he nudged her lightly with his nose, as if reassuring her that she was safe. The courtroom held its collective breath. No one had anticipated this, the innocence of a toddler paired with the quiet, powerful presence of a trained police dog. There was something almost cinematic about it, the small girl clutching her toy, the alert, calm K9 by her side, and the sudden realization that this tiny figure might hold the key to untangling a complicated case. The spectators in the courtroom felt it instinctively, even if they did not yet understand why. Emma's mother, Corinne Collins, had been hesitant about bringing her daughter to court. She had been a volunteer at the local community center where the burglary had occurred, and she knew Emma had seen certain details that adults had overlooked. But the thought of exposing her child to the harsh environment of a courtroom made her stomach twist with anxiety. Still, after careful consideration, and the guidance of both legal counsel and the judge, she agreed. Emma had a unique perspective, one born of pure observation rather than interpretation. And Judge Ramirez, with her decades of experience, had insisted that the truth could take many forms, even if it came in the smallest and least expected package. The public gallery was abuzz with quiet speculation. Some whispered that this was a publicity stunt, a strange attempt to tug at the jury's emotions. Others wondered if a child could ever remember anything useful from the night of the burglary, or if she might just make the trial a circus. Even among the seasoned attorneys, doubt flickered in their eyes. Linda Carter, the defense lawyer, adjusted her glasses and looked down at her notes, though her mind was already racing. She understood that in complex cases, every observation mattered, and if this tiny witness had seen something adults had missed, that could be a game changer. Ranger, for his part, seemed perfectly aware of the solemnity of the moment. The dog's training was impeccable, yet there was an almost human sense of anticipation in his stance. He rested his massive paws on the floor and tilted his head slightly, scanning the room with intelligence and patience. Every eye in the courtroom seemed to be drawn to him. Adults who had grown up with dogs sensed immediately the silent communication occurring between Emma and Ranger. She did not speak a word yet, but the bond was palpable. It was as if the dog understood that she had important information, and she understood that she was not alone in the enormous room. The clerk called Emma forward, and she walked, tentative but steady, gripping her stuffed puppy tightly. Her little shoes made soft tapping sounds on the polished wooden floor. She climbed carefully onto the booster seat provided by the court, and Ranger settled next to her with quiet dignity. The judge smiled gently, trying to ease the tension. "Emma," she said softly, "we are going to ask you some questions. You do not need to be afraid. Just tell us what you saw in your own words." The first few moments were awkward. The room was heavy with expectation, and Emma's voice was barely above a whisper. She looked at Ranger for reassurance and took a deep breath. Then, in the clearest voice she could manage, she said, He booped the man." A ripple of suppressed laughter passed through the courtroom, but the judge held up her hand. Silence fell once more. "Booped?" asked one of the attorneys cautiously, not wanting to sound rude. Emma nodded vigorously. "Yes, Ranger booped him with his nose." She pointed toward Ranger, who twitched his ears in acknowledgement as if confirming her words. Everyone paused, suddenly realizing that boop was not a child's nonsensical term, but likely an innocent way of describing the dog's trained, alert behavior. Adults had ignored it that night, writing off the movement as play. But here it was again, recalled exactly as it had occurred, straight from a child's memory, untouched by assumptions, filtered only through honest observation. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath again. The murmurs had faded, replaced by an almost tangible anticipation. No one was sure yet what Emma had actually witnessed, but the scene, the toddler and the K9 side by side, both calm and seemingly understanding the gravity of their roles, captured everyone's attention. Even seasoned journalists, accustomed to dramatic headlines, leaned forward instinctively, sensing that something remarkable was unfolding before their eyes. Corinne Collins sat quietly at the edge of the courtroom, watching her daughter and Ranger. She felt a surge of pride and anxiety all at once. The trial had been a confusing, drawn-out mess so far, full of technical arguments about evidence and procedure. But now, in this moment, she sensed a clarity approaching, something pure and unfiltered. Emma's memory, though tiny and simple, might illuminate what no adult had noticed: the exact moment Ranger identified the man responsible for the burglary. For a few seconds, the courtroom was utterly still, as if collectively holding its breath for what the child would say next. Cameras clicked softly, recording her expressions, while the judge and attorneys waited, acutely aware that history was not being made in headlines, but in the careful observation of a tiny witness and a loyal dog who had been trained to tell the truth in the only way he knew how. The courtroom was still buzzing quietly from the spectacle of a toddler and a police dog seated side by side, yet the focus now had to return to the matter at hand. The burglary case, which had initially seemed straightforward, was anything but. Officer Kyle Brennan, Ranger's handler, stood accused of mismanaging evidence and misinterpreting Ranger's alerts during a community event that had quickly spiraled into chaos. The prosecution insisted that Brennan had overstepped his authority, suggesting that Ranger's actions were manipulated or, at best, misread. Conversely, the defense argued that Ranger's instincts and training were flawless, and that the dog had correctly indicated the actual suspect, but no adult witness had been able to confirm it at the time. The incident itself had taken place during a weekend charity fair at the downtown community center. The center was normally bustling with children's laughter, volunteer activities, and the smell of fresh popcorn and cotton candy. That day, however, chaos had erupted in the span of minutes. A man, later dubbed the suspect by authorities, had slipped through a side entrance unnoticed. There was no immediate alarm. The security cameras captured movement, but the angle obscured the key details. Ranger, deployed to the scene for demonstration purposes by Officer Brennan, had immediately gone to the man and delivered 2 precise nose taps, the alert signal indicating the target had been detected. But amidst the distractions, the alert had gone unnoticed or had been interpreted as playful behavior. The legal debate had since intensified. Prosecutor Hayes leaned heavily on the assertion that Brennan had either misread Ranger's signal or overemphasized its significance. If proven, this would cast doubt not only on Brennan's credibility, but on Ranger's reliability as a trained K-9 witness in previous cases. Every prior case in which Ranger had provided an alert could come under scrutiny. This isn't just about a single alert, Hayes had argued in pretrial motions. It's about the integrity of the system. On the other side, defense attorney Linda Carter meticulously prepared her case, pointing out the flaws in the prosecution's assumptions. She argued that Ranger's training was rigorous, standardized, and foolproof, and that Officer Brennan had followed protocol exactly as required. Yet even she admitted privately that, without a first-hand human witness, it was difficult to convince a jury that a dog's behavior, interpreted correctly, could be trusted over the conflicting testimonies of several adults present during the event. As the court resumed that morning, both parties understood that Emma's testimony could tip the scales. No one quite knew how. After all, she was a toddler, capable of recalling simple observations, not complex sequences of events. Yet there was something uniquely compelling about the idea of hearing an unfiltered perspective, unclouded by suspicion or preconceived notions. While adults tend to rationalize or misremember under stress, a child sees things as they happen. And in this case, the seemingly innocent observations of a 3-year-old could be more accurate than the accounts of dozens of panicked adults. Corinne Collins, Emma's mother, sat at the back of the courtroom, fingers intertwined, knuckles white. She had volunteered to allow Emma to testify because she knew her daughter had seen something critical. Emma had spent hours around Ranger in the weeks leading up to the event, watching the dog respond to subtle cues and commands. It was this familiarity that gave her a perspective no adult could have. She had noticed nuances in Ranger's behavior that indicated a real alert, not playful interaction. Corinne could feel the tension in the air, realizing that her daughter's observations might clarify events that had puzzled even trained officers and investigators. The attorneys on both sides watched intently as Judge Ramirez instructed Emma to describe what she had witnessed. The courtroom had quieted, the spectators drawn forward in anticipation. For the adults, this part of the trial was unusual, even disorienting. How could a child possibly convey anything meaningful about a crime scene? Yet there was a stillness in Ranger's presence that lent credibility to the moment. He sat quietly beside Emma, large and composed, watching the proceedings with an intelligence that made it clear he understood the importance of the day. Emma began slowly, her voice soft but clear. "Ranger," he went to the man, she said, pointing at the K-9. The attorneys froze, leaning forward. "The man with the shiny watch." Ranger booped him 2 times. Laughter bubbled quietly in the gallery, but the judge raised her hand to maintain order. A hush fell over the room, leaving only the sound of Ranger's tail brushing the polished wooden floor and the occasional scratch of a pen. The meaning of the word boop became the center of attention. For Emma, it was simple. Ranger touched someone with his nose. But for the courtroom, this tiny detail carried enormous significance. Officer Brennan explained, gently and without condescension, that Ranger's boop was, in fact, a trained alert, a signal that the dog had detected the scent of a person of interest. The revelation hit the room like a wave. Adults had dismissed the movement as playful at the time, but now, described plainly by a child, it became the evidence everyone had overlooked. Defense attorney Carter requested to revisit the security footage. What had been dismissed as background noise or trivial motion now took on new importance. The video was replayed in the courtroom, frame by frame. There it was, a man with a shining silver watch stepping through the crowd. Ranger approached him, paused, and touched him twice with his nose. The alert was precise and unmistakable, exactly as Emma had described. Even the prosecution, forced to watch the clip without interruption, could no longer argue that the behavior was casual or coincidental. The courtroom erupted, but not in chaos, rather in a tense mix of astonishment and awe. Prosecutor Hayes adjusted his glasses, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Officer Brennan exhaled, shoulders slumping in relief. The misinterpretation of Ranger's actions, which had threatened to tarnish his career, was now revealed for what it had been: a simple misunderstanding caused by adult assumptions, and it had taken the innocent eyes of a toddler to correct it. Emma's testimony shifted more than just the focus of the case. It reframed the narrative entirely. What had once been a story about mishandled evidence and professional negligence was now about clarity and the power of observation. The jurors, many of whom had been skeptical of the proceedings, began to see the situation with fresh perspective. Adults, who often complicate matters with overanalysis, had overlooked the obvious, while a child had provided a clear, unvarnished account. Even the journalists taking notes could not hide their fascination. Headlines formed in their minds: "Toddler turns courtroom upside down," or "K9 and child solve case." They wrote as if they were witnessing history, knowing that the combination of innocence and precision had created a story no one could have predicted. Emma's courage to speak, coupled with Ranger's steady presence, had brought an entire courtroom to a halt, not in spectacle alone, but in recognition of truth. By mid-morning, the mood had shifted. What began as a typical, tense legal proceeding now carried the electric charge of revelation. Witnesses, lawyers, and spectators alike had been reminded that sometimes justice relies not on assumptions or rehearsed testimonies, but on simple observation and honesty. A toddler, who could barely reach the witness stand, had illuminated a critical moment. The story was no longer about a missing alert or a mismanaged investigation. It was about how clarity could come from the most unexpected places. For Officer Brennan, this was more than vindication. It was a lesson in humility. The case had challenged his professionalism and tested his credibility. Yet the truth, clear, undeniable, and delivered through an innocent voice, had prevailed. Ranger, ever loyal and composed, remained beside Emma, a silent partner in revealing what adults had failed to see. Their bond, forged through weeks of training and interaction, had become the lens through which the courtroom now understood the night of the burglary. Corinne Collins felt a profound mixture of relief and pride. Her daughter, who could barely form sentences, had performed a remarkable act of observation that would resonate far beyond the confines of the courtroom. And as Emma shifted slightly in her seat, eyes bright with curiosity and courage, she had no idea how powerful her small voice had become. What had started as a simple day at the community center had transformed into a defining moment in the lives of everyone present. By the time the court recessed for a brief lunch, it was clear to all involved that the dynamics of the trial had changed irrevocably. The prosecution faced a difficult path forward, and the defense had gained an invaluable edge. Yet the most important revelation of all remained simple and profound. Sometimes the truth comes not from experience, analysis, or authority, but from observation, innocence, and honesty. A toddler, armed with nothing more than clarity and memory, had reminded a room full of adults why justice often depends on seeing what is plainly there, if only someone has the courage to say it aloud. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the courtroom, illuminating the polished wood panels and giving the room a sense of warmth that contrasted sharply with the tension lingering in the air. While the trial's formal proceedings continued around her, little Emma Collins sat quietly on her booster seat, her small fingers clutching her worn stuffed puppy as if it were a talisman of courage. To most adults, she seemed delicate, almost fragile, a tiny presence in a vast room of serious faces and towering authority. But beneath that delicate exterior was a child whose observations, honed by hours of careful watching, would soon upend assumptions that adults had clung to for weeks. No one outside of her immediate family had known until recently that Emma had been present during the chaotic incident at the community center. Most people would have dismissed a toddler's recollection as irrelevant or fanciful. Adults often underestimated the power of children's memory, assuming that young minds could only retain fleeting impressions. The color of balloons, the taste of snacks, or the melody of a song. They rarely considered that a child, particularly one who had a deep, personal connection to the subject at hand, could observe and retain details with startling precision. And in Emma's case, that connection was with Ranger, the police K-9 whose calm intelligence contrasted sharply with the confusion of the adult witnesses. Corinne Collins, Emma's mother, had long recognized her daughter's unique abilities. Emma had spent countless hours alongside Ranger during her mother's volunteer shifts at the community center. While other children ran around the gym or ignored the dogs, Emma approached Ranger slowly and respectfully. She had learned which gestures prompted the dog to respond and which were merely playful movements. Ranger, in turn, had grown accustomed to her presence, recognizing the child as a gentle observer rather than an unwitting distraction. Their bond was quiet but profound, a shared understanding that went beyond words. In a sense, Ranger had become both teacher and protector, and Emma had absorbed lessons about attention, observation, and trust that even adults sometimes overlooked. The night of the burglary had been chaotic in ways that only an untrained eye could perceive. Adults were rushing to secure the event, vendors were shouting over each other, and the noise of the crowd created a blur of movement. Security cameras recorded the scene, but the angles obscured crucial details. Ranger, deployed by Officer Brennan, moved through the crowd with the precision of a trained professional, yet most humans present were too distracted to notice the dog's subtle cues. It was a moment of heightened tension, yet one that Emma, with her quiet patience and careful observation, captured in her memory. She noticed the small, telling details, the way Ranger's ears twitched when he detected a particular scent, the subtle pause before he nudged the man with the shiny watch, and the double tap of his nose that adults later dismissed as casual play. To the casual observer, Emma's small frame and childlike curiosity would have seemed insignificant. Yet the precision with which she had witnessed Ranger's behavior made her an invaluable link to the events that unfolded. When her mother initially suggested she testify, the defense team had hesitated. After all, how much could a toddler's perspective matter in a court of law? But Judge Ramirez, ever thoughtful and experienced in navigating unusual cases, recognized that truth often emerges in unexpected ways. Emma's testimony could reveal what had been obscured by adult assumptions, rushed observations, and overcomplicated analysis. As the trial progressed into the afternoon, the tension in the courtroom heightened. Prosecutor Hayes had tried to preempt any impact of Emma's testimony, insisting that her observations would be too simplistic to carry weight. "We are dealing with trained professionals here," he argued, voice steady but edged with frustration. "We cannot rely on a child who barely knows the difference between observation and imagination." But the defense countered with careful reasoning. Linda Carter emphasized that Emma had spent hours observing Ranger in a controlled, safe environment, learning to recognize subtle cues and behaviors that even trained adults had overlooked. The judge finally called Emma forward again, and the courtroom fell silent, as if holding its collective breath. Ranger padded quietly to her side, settling on the floor with the same patient intelligence he displayed during training. The dog's calm presence seemed to give Emma confidence. She clutched her stuffed puppy tighter, looked at Ranger, and then began to speak. "I saw him," she said, pointing to the man with the silver watch. Ranger touched him 2 times. He knew it was the man. Her small voice, steady and clear, carried across the room, silencing murmurs and refocusing attention. It was not the vocabulary that mattered but the precision of her observation. She recalled not only the action but the timing, the context, and the unmistakable signal Ranger had given. For the adults in the courtroom, it was a revelation. The sequence of events they had struggled to interpret for weeks was being described clearly by someone with no bias, no assumptions, and no preconceived notions. Corinne Collins watched her daughter with a mixture of awe and anxiety. She had known Emma had observed the events in detail, but seeing her articulate them in front of an audience of skeptical adults was both frightening and exhilarating. The courtroom's focus shifted subtly. Prosecutor Hayes leaned forward in his chair, his previously confident demeanor tinged with uncertainty. Even seasoned journalists paused mid-note, realizing that Emma's words, simple though they were, might hold the key to resolving the tangled mess of allegations, assumptions, and overlooked evidence. The meaning of Emma's words had to be clarified. "Booped," she had said, pointing to Ranger. To an adult, it sounded whimsical, playful, perhaps meaningless. But Ranger's handler explained calmly. The boop was a trained signal, a precise indication of detection, not a casual gesture. The courtroom skepticism was replaced by careful attention. Every adult present had overlooked the same subtle behavior during the chaotic event. Emma's memory, unaffected by bias or stress, had preserved the truth. As the afternoon progressed, the defense requested to review the security footage once again. What adults had ignored as background noise suddenly demanded scrutiny. Emma's observations provided the context needed to identify the suspect clearly. When the video replayed, the double nose taps, previously dismissed, were now undeniable. Ranger had correctly identified the individual in question. The adult witnesses, who had interpreted Ranger's behavior through a lens of doubt, could not ignore the child's accurate recollection. The courtroom began to understand that truth could emerge from unexpected sources. The implications were significant. Officer Brennan, previously under intense scrutiny, was suddenly vindicated. The idea that a child's observations could correct adult misunderstanding challenged many preconceived notions about credibility, evidence, and memory. Yet, as Judge Ramirez reminded the room, the law seeks truth in all forms. Emma, in her innocent clarity, had provided a perspective that adults had overlooked. The jurors, now fully engaged, watched carefully as the evidence was contextualized through the lens of her testimony. Ranger's behavior throughout the proceedings reinforced the bond between child and dog. He remained calm, alert, and responsive, offering subtle cues of reassurance to Emma. This silent communication added weight to her words. Adults, accustomed to formal testimony, were struck by the profound simplicity of the interaction. The dog validated the child's memory through presence alone. It was a lesson in observation, trust, and the ways in which truth can be communicated beyond conventional language. Corinne Collins felt a mixture of pride and anxiety. She had known Emma's perspective was valuable, but she had not anticipated the profound impact it would have on the trial. As the hours passed, it became increasingly clear that the combination of Emma's observations and Ranger's training had revealed details that no adult could have reconstructed alone. The case, once mired in confusion, began to clarify. Every nuance mattered, and the child's testimony became the guiding thread through the complexity. By late afternoon, the courtroom had transformed. What had begun as a simple burglary trial had become a study in perception, memory, and the unexpected sources of truth. Emma's clear, unfiltered account had illuminated critical moments previously obscured by human distraction and assumption. The jurors leaned forward, captivated not by theatrics but by clarity and precision. The legal teams, previously at odds, now approached the case with renewed focus, guided by the small yet undeniable insights of a toddler who had quietly observed, remembered, and recounted the facts with startling accuracy. The day ended with the realization that no one had truly underestimated the power of observation until now. Children, often dismissed as too small or too naive, could perceive truth in ways adults could not. Ranger, vigilant and calm, had served as both teacher and partner. And Emma, though unaware of the historical significance of her testimony, had done something remarkable. She had reminded an entire courtroom that clarity, honesty, and observation are sometimes the most powerful tools of all. As the court recessed, the murmurs of awe and disbelief lingered in the room. The legal teams, reporters, jurors, and even the judge felt the weight of what had occurred. A toddler's perspective had become a pivot point, reshaping understanding and revealing truths that adults had overlooked. In that moment, it was clear that this trial would not be remembered merely for its procedural significance, but for the profound lesson it offered about observation, trust, and the unexpected sources from which clarity can emerge. The courtroom had changed in tone since the morning. What had started as routine proceedings now carried an undercurrent of anticipation and tension. The jurors, once skeptical of a toddler's presence, leaned forward in their seats, eyes fixed on the small figure of Emma Collins perched in her booster chair. Ranger, the police K-9, sat at her side like a sentinel, calm, watchful, and alert. His presence lent a gravity to the scene that was difficult for anyone to ignore. The dog's trained gaze seemed almost human in its intensity, scanning the room with quiet authority, reminding everyone that beneath the innocence of the child lay a truth that adults had failed to perceive. Prosecutor Mark Hayes shifted uneasily in his chair, reviewing his notes with a forced air of calm. He had prepared for every conceivable line of argument, every piece of evidence, every testimony that could be presented by the defense. Yet the addition of a 3-year-old as a witness had thrown his strategy into disarray. He had expected adults, trained professionals, perhaps even security personnel to testify. But a toddler, how could this possibly influence the proceedings? He couldn't ignore the fact that her observations had already aligned perfectly with certain overlooked details. Defense attorney Linda Carter, on the other hand, exuded a quiet confidence. She had long argued that Ranger's behavior was precise, consistent, and scientifically verifiable. Now, Emma's testimony had provided clarity where human witnesses had only confusion. Yet even Carter approached this moment with caution. Children were unpredictable in the courtroom, and the defense could not afford for the testimony to falter under pressure. She adjusted her glasses and leaned forward, preparing to guide the child through her recollections with patience and care. The judge, Judge Ramirez, observed the courtroom with a mixture of curiosity and concern. She had authorized Emma's testimony precisely because of her potential value, but she knew the risk involved. The courtroom was an intimidating place, even for trained adults, and a toddler's ability to communicate clearly could easily be disrupted by nerves or distraction. Ramirez had seen many trials derailed by unexpected events, but this was something unprecedented. She silently reminded herself that her role was to facilitate the pursuit of truth, even when that truth emerged from the smallest and most surprising of sources. As Emma began to recount her observations in more detail, the courtroom tension deepened. He walked past the table," she said, her small fingers pointing vaguely toward the gallery. Then Ranger went boop, boop, 2 times. The simplicity of her words belied their importance. Adults, accustomed to technical jargon and careful phrasing, were forced to reinterpret the events through the lens of a child's memory. The subtlety of Ranger's nose taps, previously dismissed as playful or coincidental, now took center stage. They were no longer minor details, they were critical evidence. The murmurs in the courtroom had not entirely died down, though most were hushed whispers. Spectators leaned forward, reporters furiously typed notes, and even jurors whispered among themselves. The credibility of a 3-year-old seemed implausible at first glance, yet the alignment between her recollections and the physical evidence could not be ignored. Emma's testimony was a rare and unexpected lens through which the truth could be seen clearly, unfiltered by human ego or bias. She had observed what had been missed, and now, piece by piece, the courtroom was starting to realize the weight of her observations. Prosecutor Hayes decided to intervene. "Your Honor," he said carefully, standing and gesturing toward the child. "While the witness is, well, young, the defense seems to rely on her memory as definitive. I would argue that a toddler's recollection is prone to error. We cannot base the outcome of this trial on observations that may be colored by misunderstanding or imagination." His voice was measured but firm, attempting to reinforce the notion that logic and experience must prevail. Judge Ramirez nodded slowly. "We are aware of the concerns, Mr. Hayes. However, this court has already considered the context in which the observations were made. The witness's proximity to the events, combined with her repeated interactions with the K-9, provide a reasonable basis for her testimony. We will proceed, ensuring that questions are clear and concise, and that she is supported in providing her account." Her words were calm but commanding, leaving little room for dispute. As the questioning continued, Emma displayed a surprising composure. Her initial hesitation had melted away, replaced by quiet confidence born from familiarity with Ranger. She gestured toward the man in question, describing not only the precise action of Ranger's nose taps but also subtle aspects of the suspect's behavior. The way he moved his hand, the shiny watch on his wrist, the way he looked around nervously. Adults who had reviewed security footage repeatedly had never noticed these nuances in real time. A child's perspective, unburdened by assumptions or expectation, had captured details that had eluded trained eyes. Ranger remained vigilant beside her, his massive body still, alert and poised. There was a subtle intelligence in his gaze, as if silently endorsing her words. Those who observed closely could see the interaction, the quiet communication between dog and child, a partnership built over weeks of trust and gentle teaching. The courtroom could not deny the effect. The dog's presence amplified the credibility of her observations, reinforcing the fact that what she described was consistent with trained K-9 behavior. The jurors began to adjust in their seats, their initial skepticism giving way to careful consideration. Some whispered softly among themselves, noting the accuracy and confidence in Emma's recall. It was difficult to ignore the clarity of her memory, especially when juxtaposed against conflicting adult testimonies. The prosecution, too, found itself in unfamiliar territory. Hayes could no longer rely on the assumption that a child's recollection would be easily dismissed. The alignment between her words and the available evidence was undeniable. At one point, Emma hesitated briefly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her small face. Judge Ramirez offered a reassuring smile. "Take your time, Emma. You do not need to rush. Just tell us what you remember." The encouragement seemed to reset the child's focus. She took a deep breath, adjusted her grip on the stuffed puppy, and continued. Her small voice described Ranger's alert with clarity, noting how the dog paused, sniffed, and tapped twice. Actions that, to the untrained eye, seemed insignificant but were central to understanding the sequence of events that night. Karen Collins watched silently, her emotions a complex mixture of pride, anxiety, and awe. She had long known that Emma had a sharp memory and a keen observational ability, but seeing her daughter communicate under pressure, in front of strangers and a courtroom full of authority, was almost overwhelming. Emma's presence was proving to be more than symbolic. It was instrumental. She was clarifying the events of a night that had confused even trained officers, and doing so with honesty and simplicity that left no room for misinterpretation. The defense requested that the court replay portions of the event on the security footage. With Emma's guidance, the team could pinpoint the exact moments of Ranger's alert. As the video rolled, the jurors and spectators saw for the first time the alignment between the child's testimony and the dog's trained behavior. The double nose tap, previously overlooked or dismissed as casual movement, was now revealed in its full significance. Even those who had been staunchly skeptical began to nod subtly, recognizing the accuracy of Emma's recall. By mid-afternoon, the courtroom atmosphere had shifted entirely. What had begun as a routine, procedural trial was now transformed into a study of observation, memory, and unexpected clarity. A toddler, through her attentive presence and precise recollection, had reframed the narrative of the case. Adults who had relied on assumptions were forced to reconsider every step, every decision, and every interpretation they had made. The trial's focus had shifted, and the tension in the room was palpable. Even the reporters took note of the profound impact of the child's testimony. Their fingers flew across keyboards, capturing every word, every gesture, and every glance. Headlines were already forming in their minds. Toddler alters courtroom dynamics, and K9 and child reveal overlooked truth. The story was compelling not only because of the legal implications, but because it illuminated a universal truth. Clarity and observation are sometimes found in the most unexpected places. Officer Brennan, meanwhile, experienced a sense of cautious relief. The scrutiny that had threatened to tarnish his career was now beginning to lift. Ranger's trained behavior, which had been misinterpreted by adults, was validated through Emma's recollection. The bond between the handler, the dog, and the child had created a unique triangulation of truth that no adult alone could have replicated. It was a humbling realization. The system, meticulous as it was, had almost overlooked the simplest explanation, hidden in plain sight through the eyes of a small child. As the courtroom recessed briefly for a break, murmurs of disbelief and admiration circulated. Lawyers, jurors, and spectators alike recognized that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Emma's observations had brought clarity, her honesty had directed attention, and Ranger's presence had lent weight and legitimacy. The day's proceedings had proven that even the smallest, quietest voices can illuminate truths that others overlook. Adults had complicated matters. Children, in their innocence, sometimes see the essence of events with striking precision. Corinne Collins gently squeezed Emma's shoulder as the child nibbled on her stuffed puppy for comfort. She whispered a quiet word of encouragement, acknowledging the courage it took for her daughter to speak clearly in front of so many strangers. Ranger rested his massive head beside Emma, a silent reassurance that she was not alone. And in that moment, the courtroom, filled with tension, skepticism, and doubt, collectively began to understand the power of observation, the weight of honesty, and the impact that a child, guided by experience and empathy, could have on the pursuit of justice. The courtroom had settled into a rhythm that seemed almost surreal. What began as a typical legal proceeding had transformed into a story of observation, trust, and unexpected clarity. The jurors, reporters, and spectators had all grown accustomed to watching a toddler and a police dog command the room's attention. Ranger's presence remained constant, poised and alert beside Emma, a silent testament to the precision and reliability that adults had previously doubted. Officer Brennan, once under immense scrutiny, now sat with cautious hope, realizing that the outcome of the trial was beginning to tilt in his favor, not because of legal strategy alone, but because of a child's memory and a dog's training. Emma, having gained confidence after earlier rounds of questioning, was now asked to recount more details of the night at the community center. She adjusted herself on the booster seat, gripping her stuffed puppy tightly as if drawing strength from its familiarity. Her small voice, calm yet deliberate, began to narrate the events she had witnessed. "He came in, the man. He walked past the table with balloons," she said, pointing vaguely toward the gallery. "Ranger, he sniffed him, 2 boops. Then he looked scared." The courtroom fell silent once more. Adults, who had been trained to interpret complex testimony and technical evidence, were suddenly captivated by the clarity and specificity of a 3-year-old's account. Emma's words, unembellished and straightforward, carried a weight that no amount of argument or legal reasoning could replicate. Her recollections aligned perfectly with the physical evidence. The double nose tap, the suspect's movement, and even the subtle signs of nervousness that most adults had missed in the chaos of the event. Prosecutor Hayes rose, attempting to maintain authority. Your Honor, while the witness's account is colorful, I must emphasize that children are prone to misinterpretation. Memories at that age are unreliable. We cannot base a verdict on observations that could easily be colored by imagination. His words were measured, but there was a subtle undercurrent of unease. The courtroom's attention was no longer fully on him. The focus had shifted irrevocably toward Emma and Ranger. Judge Ramirez, who had patiently guided the proceedings thus far, responded calmly. We are aware of the concerns, Mr. Hayes. However, the witness's proximity to the events, combined with her repeated interaction with the K-9, provide a reasonable basis for the testimony. The court will continue to consider her account in context with other evidence. Her words carried authority, emphasizing that credibility is not always dictated by age, but by the circumstances of observation and the consistency of recollection. Linda Carter, the defense attorney, now guided Emma through the finer details of what she had seen. Emma, can you show us what Ranger did when he went to the man? She asked gently. The child leaned slightly forward, gesturing toward Ranger, who remained perfectly still but attentive. He sniffed, boop, boop. Then he stared at him. The man moved fast, then hid the bag. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. That was the moment the trial had been building toward. A child's testimony connecting the K-9's behavior to an action directly related to the suspected crime. The jurors, who had been skeptical of both the dog's behavior and the child's recall, now leaned forward, their attention rapt. Even seasoned reporters found themselves captivated by the interplay of innocence and precision, realizing that a toddler's words were clarifying critical aspects of a complex case. Karen Collins watched from the back, a mixture of pride and anxiety washing over her. She had known Emma's observations were detailed, but seeing her articulate them with confidence in front of an audience of strangers and authority figures was both overwhelming and exhilarating. Her daughter was no longer just a participant. She had become central to the trial, providing clarity where adults had faltered. Officer Brennan exhaled quietly, relieved that the evidence now supported his interpretation of Ranger's actions. For weeks, his credibility had been questioned and his training methods scrutinized. Now, Emma's words, backed by Ranger's precision, were vindicating both his actions and the dog's behavior. The courtroom, once tense with doubt, now seemed to lean toward a shared understanding. The events had been misunderstood, and the truth, as revealed by the child, was simple yet undeniable. Prosecutor Hayes, sensing the shift, attempted one final strategy. He called for adult witnesses who had been present at the event to recount their recollections of Ranger's behavior. Each account, however, was inconsistent, colored by confusion and the chaos of the moment. One security officer described the dog's actions as playful, while a vendor recalled only glimpses of movement that seemed inconsequential at the time. None could match the clarity and consistency of Emma's observations. The contrast was stark. Adults, constrained by assumptions, distractions, and the overwhelming number of stimuli, had failed to notice what was plainly there. Emma, guided by familiarity and focused attention, had captured the sequence of events with remarkable accuracy. The jury, seeing the disparities between adult recollections and the child's precise account, began to understand that truth does not always emerge from experience or training. It often comes from careful observation and honesty, even if expressed in the simplest of terms. The defense requested a replay of the security footage, this time guided by Emma's detailed account. The video highlighted the moment she had described: the suspect entering, moving past the table, the double nose tap by Ranger, and the subsequent actions involving the bag. Every detail Emma had mentioned aligned perfectly with the footage, validating her testimony and clarifying the sequence of events. The courtroom watched in awe, recognizing the profound accuracy of a child's memory when coupled with attentive observation. Ranger's calm presence continued to reinforce the narrative. While adults debated and interpreted, the dog remained a silent witness, embodying the training, patience, and focus that had allowed the child to notice what others missed. The partnership between Emma and Ranger had become a focal point. The child observed, the dog executed precise actions, and together they created a record of truth that transcended traditional adult reasoning. By late afternoon, the trial had reached a pivotal moment. The courtroom had shifted from skepticism to fascination, and the jurors now viewed the case through a lens shaped by the child's testimony. What had once been a story of alleged mishandling and misinterpretation was now a clear narrative of observant action, training, and accurate recall. The prosecutor's arguments, once dominant, now seemed secondary to the tangible evidence validated by the child's observations. Corinne Collins felt a profound sense of relief. She had known Emma's testimony was valuable, but she had not anticipated the sweeping impact it would have on the trial. Her daughter had done more than recall events. She had shaped understanding, corrected misinterpretations, and provided a perspective that adults alone could not have achieved. The courtroom, previously focused on disputes and legal nuance, now recognized the power of clarity and observation, and the subtle authority a child could wield when telling the truth. As the day drew to a close, Judge Ramirez provided a reminder of the significance of the proceedings. This court has witnessed an unusual but instructive moment. The combination of trained observation and honest recollection, even from unexpected sources, has clarified the events under scrutiny. All testimony will be weighed carefully, and the pursuit of truth remains paramount. Her words acknowledge the unprecedented nature of the case, emphasizing that clarity, honesty, and precise observation are crucial elements of justice. The courtroom emptied slowly, the echoes of murmured discussions and reflective whispers lingering in the air. Reporters captured the scene, noting the unprecedented role a toddler had played in shaping the understanding of a complex event. Jurors left with a newfound appreciation for the subtleties of observation. Adults reconsidered their assumptions, and Officer Brennan quietly reflected on the journey that had led to this point. Ranger, ever composed, followed him out, maintaining the calm vigilance that had marked every moment of the trial. In the quiet aftermath, Corinne Collins knelt to speak softly to Emma. "You were amazing today," she whispered, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. Emma smiled faintly, hugging her stuffed puppy tightly, unaware of the broader impact of her words. To her, she had simply told the truth, observed carefully, and described what she saw. Yet in doing so, she had transformed the courtroom's understanding and altered the course of the trial. For Officer Brennan, the day had been a lesson in patience, trust, and the unexpected sources of clarity. His bond with Ranger had allowed a child to observe accurately and communicate effectively. What adults had dismissed as playful behavior had been revealed as precise, deliberate, and significant. The courtroom had witnessed something rare, the intersection of innocence, training, and observation resulting in an undeniable account of truth. By the time the courtroom lights dimmed, it was clear that Part 5 of this unfolding story marked a turning point. The balance had shifted. The prosecution's narrative of mishandling and error was weakened by the undeniable alignment of child testimony and K-9 precision. The defense, fortified by Emma's clarity, moved forward with newfound strength. And the courtroom, full of adults accustomed to authority, had learned an invaluable lesson. Sometimes, the smallest voices carry the clearest truth. The courtroom atmosphere had shifted dramatically by the sixth day of the trial. The tension that had gripped the room earlier in the week was now laced with a sense of anticipation and uncertainty. Jurors, once focused solely on adult testimony and procedural technicalities, now leaned forward in their seats, visibly attentive to every movement, gesture, and word emanating from the small figure of Emma Collins. The toddler had become an unanticipated pivot in the case, her presence forcing everyone to reconsider what constituted credible evidence. Ranger, the police K-9, remained by her side, a silent sentinel whose calm and composed demeanor underscored the precision of the observations Emma described. Emma had grown more confident with each session. Her voice, small yet clear, carried across the room as she recounted the night of the community center incident with vivid detail. He went fast, ran past the balloons. Ranger sniffed him, 2 boops. Then he grabbed the bag and ran, she said, pointing first at Ranger and then at an imaginary trajectory across the floor. Her recollection was meticulous, and even the adults in the courtroom had begun to recognize the unerring accuracy of her testimony. Every detail she described was validated by both security footage and the dog's trained behavior, forming a consistent narrative that adults had failed to perceive during the initial chaos. Prosecutor Hayes attempted to reassert control, rising from his chair with measured precision. "Your Honor, while the witness is unusual, her account remains subjective and prone to interpretation. Children at this age may misrepresent events, influenced by imagination or suggestion," he said, trying to inject doubt into the proceedings. But his words carried less weight now. The jurors had begun to internalize the alignment between Emma's testimony and observable evidence, realizing that her account, simple as it was, clarified discrepancies that had confounded adult witnesses. Judge Ramirez, seated with calm authority, nodded subtly. "The court acknowledges the concerns, Mr. Hayes. The witness's testimony will be weighed alongside other evidence, including security footage, adult witness accounts, and expert testimony. The focus remains the pursuit of truth, which may emerge from unexpected sources." Her words emphasized a crucial principle: credibility does not always correlate with age. Truth, she reminded all present, can appear in forms that challenge conventional assumptions. The defense team, led by Linda Carter, guided Emma to elaborate further on Ranger's actions and the suspect's behavior. "Emma," Carter asked gently, "can you show us again what the man did after Ranger sniffed him?" The child paused briefly, concentrating, her tiny brows furrowed in thought. "He looked scared, then ran, grabbed the bag. Ranger followed and barked," she explained. Her gestures were precise, mimicking the movements of both Ranger and the suspect, with a clarity that no adult witness had been able to replicate. The jurors were visibly affected. Murmurs filled the courtroom, subtle but pervasive, as the audience began to recognize the extraordinary alignment between the child's memory and the recorded evidence. The sequence of events, once muddled by confusion and contradictory adult testimony, now made sense in a linear, coherent manner. Emma's simple words had untangled weeks of ambiguity, transforming what seemed like chaotic events into a narrative that was both comprehensible and compelling. Corinne Collins, seated quietly near the back, felt a surge of pride and anxiety simultaneously. She had long known that Emma possessed a sharp memory and keen observational skills, but the courtroom exposure was unlike anything she had imagined. Her daughter was no longer a passive observer. She was actively reshaping the trial, providing insights that even trained professionals had missed. Each word Emma spoke, each gesture she made, reaffirmed the power of observation and the importance of presenting evidence clearly and honestly. Ranger's calm demeanor continued to enhance the child's credibility. The dog remained alert, watching the proceedings with an intelligence that seemed almost human. Every slight movement of his ears, every subtle shift in posture, complemented Emma's testimony, reinforcing the narrative of precise detection. The courtroom, long accustomed to procedural formality and legal technicalities, now observed a unique synergy between child and K-9 that was impossible to ignore. As the questioning progressed, it became apparent that the jury's perception was shifting. Adults who had once been confident in their interpretations now found themselves reconsidering the sequence of events. The security footage, when replayed under Emma's guidance, revealed subtleties previously overlooked. The exact moment Ranger had detected the suspect, the manner in which the man attempted to evade observation, and the significance of the double-nose tap. Each detail corroborated Emma's testimony, leaving little room for doubt. Prosecutor Hayes, sensing the shift, attempted another approach. He called upon expert witnesses in law enforcement and K-9 behavior to interpret Ranger's actions. Each expert, however, corroborated what Emma had described, explaining that Ranger's trained signals, particularly the double nose tap, were consistent indicators of detecting a target. The testimony, intended to support the prosecution, instead strengthened the defense's position. The alignment of child observation, dog behavior, and expert validation created a triangulated truth that the jury could not easily dismiss. The jurors' body language was telling. Some leaned forward, hands clasped, eyes fixed on Emma and Ranger. Others exchanged subtle glances, a quiet acknowledgement of the clarity emerging from an unlikely source. The initial skepticism about a toddler's testimony had transformed into careful attention, a recognition that precision, honesty, and observation sometimes surpass years of experience. The courtroom's collective realization was almost palpable. Emma's account was not merely anecdotal, it was central to understanding what had truly occurred. Corinne Collins whispered quietly to herself, reflecting on the irony of the situation. The child she had worried about being overwhelmed by the courtroom was now the source of clarity for everyone present. It was a reminder that insight and truth are not always dictated by age or authority, but by the ability to perceive, remember, and communicate accurately. Her heart swelled with pride as she watched Emma continue, unfazed by the room's attention or the weight of the responsibility she had unwittingly assumed. Officer Brennan, too, felt the profound impact of the day's proceedings. Weeks of scrutiny, doubts, and misinterpretations had now been addressed through a combination of trained K-9 behavior and the clear observation of a child. What adults had overlooked in the chaos was now evident to all. Ranger had followed protocol precisely, and Emma had remembered it faithfully. The validation was not just professional, it was deeply personal, affirming the trust and bond he had cultivated with his dog and the child who had become an unexpected witness. By mid-afternoon, the momentum of the trial had unmistakably shifted. The prosecution's narrative, built on doubt and alternative interpretations, had lost its grip. The child's testimony, reinforced by Ranger's actions and expert validation, had provided a coherent, consistent account of the events in question. Every moment of observation, every subtle detail, was now being interpreted in light of Emma's recollections. The jury, initially skeptical, now faced a clear dichotomy: accept the child's testimony corroborated by evidence, or attempt to reconcile contradictory adult accounts that had proven unreliable. The courtroom held its collective breath as Emma, encouraged gently by Carter, elaborated on the suspect's attempts to evade Ranger. He ran fast, hid behind the table, then Ranger barked. The man dropped the bag. Her gestures mimicked the rapid movements of both the suspect and the dog, offering a visual reconstruction that was impossible to ignore. Even the most skeptical observers could see the alignment between her actions, her words, and the evidence presented on video. The simplicity and honesty of her account had transformed the abstract confusion of adult recollections into a vivid, coherent narrative. Corinne Collins allowed herself a quiet sigh of relief. Her daughter's testimony had not only clarified the facts, it had begun to reshape perceptions. The courtroom, filled with adults trained to interpret evidence and behavior, now had to confront the undeniable. A small child, guided by observation and trust, had revealed the truth more clearly than any adult witness. The realization rippled quietly but powerfully through the room, leaving a mark on jurors, lawyers, and spectators alike. As the day drew toward its close, Judge Ramirez addressed the courtroom. "We have witnessed an extraordinary example of observation and recall," she said. "The testimony of this young witness, supported by trained K-9 behavior and expert validation, has clarified key events. The court will continue to weigh all evidence carefully, but it is clear that even the smallest voices can provide powerful insight." Her words, measured and authoritative, reinforced the unusual but undeniable significance of Emma's contribution. The courtroom emptied slowly, murmurs of astonishment and reflection lingering in the air. Jurors left with new perspectives on credibility and observation. Reporters prepared stories highlighting the remarkable clarity of a child's testimony, and the legal teams quietly processed the shift in momentum. Ranger, calm and composed, followed Officer Brennan out of the room, his steady presence a reminder of the discipline and training that had made Emma's observations possible. In the quiet aftermath, Corinne knelt to speak softly to her daughter. "You've done something amazing today," she whispered. Emma hugged her stuffed puppy tightly, smiling faintly. To the child, it had simply been about telling the truth, observing carefully and describing what she saw. Yet the implications were enormous. Her honesty, combined with her careful attention, had reshaped the trial's trajectory, leaving a lasting impact on everyone present. For Officer Brennan, the day was a testament to patience, trust, and the unexpected sources from which clarity can emerge. Ranger had provided training, guidance, and validation, while Emma had supplied the eyes and memory to translate those actions into understandable evidence. The courtroom had witnessed something extraordinary, the convergence of innocence, expertise, and observation producing an account of truth that could not be ignored. As the lights dimmed and the courtroom emptied, it was clear that Part 6 marked a critical turning point. The jury, previously uncertain, had begun to lean toward understanding the events as they truly occurred. The prosecution's narrative had weakened, while the child's testimony, validated by both dog and evidence, had strengthened the defense's position. And more importantly, the trial had demonstrated a universal lesson. Sometimes, clarity comes not from authority or experience, but from observation, honesty, and the courage to speak truthfully, even when that truth emerges from the smallest among us. The courtroom was electric that morning. The air buzzed with tension, anticipation, and a peculiar mix of curiosity and awe. The trial, which had begun as a standard investigation into a suspicious incident at the community center, had evolved into an extraordinary narrative led by a 3-year-old child and a police K-9. Emma Collins, perched in her booster seat, clutched her stuffed puppy tightly while Ranger sat at her side, perfectly still yet radiating an alert, quiet intensity. Every person in the room, jurors, lawyers, reporters, and spectators, felt the weight of the impending revelation. This was the day the trial would pivot decisively. Corinne Collins held her breath as the judge called the court to order. "Today, we will hear the final series of testimony from the young witness and observe any further evidence necessary to clarify the events in question," Judge Ramirez announced, her tone calm but commanding. She cast a careful glance at Emma and Ranger. "We are aware this is unusual, but this court recognizes the importance of every credible account, regardless of the source." Emma adjusted her grip on the stuffed puppy and looked at Ranger, who gave a subtle nudge of his head as if to reassure her. She drew a deep breath and began to speak in her small but confident voice. "He came in, ran past the table, balloons fell. Ranger sniffed him, boop, boop. Then he grabbed the bag and ran," she said, pointing in the general direction of the suspect's path. The words themselves were simple, yet they carried a weight that none of the adult testimony had managed to achieve. The defense attorney, Linda Carter, leaned forward with a subtle smile. "Emma," she prompted gently, "can you tell us what happened next? What did Ranger do when the man ran?" Emma's tiny face scrunched in concentration. "He barked, then chased. Then the man dropped the bag. Ranger stayed, sniffed, and stayed near it." Her hand mimicked the suspect's frantic movements, drawing a mental map for the jurors that clarified the previously ambiguous sequence of events. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Witnesses who had testified earlier looked down at their notes, reconsidering their recollections. The adults' prior confusion, their conflicting stories, and misinterpretations were starkly contrasted with Emma's precision. Every subtle action, the double nose tap, the barking, the suspect's attempt to evade, was now accounted for in her recollection. The alignment with security footage was uncanny, leaving little room for doubt. Prosecutor Hayes struggled to maintain composure. Rising to his feet, he attempted to introduce counterpoints. Your Honor, while the witness's account is vivid, we must remember the age factor. Children can confuse sequences or fill gaps with imagination. His words, intended to cast doubt, now felt almost hollow. The courtroom, already attuned to the clarity of Emma's account, seemed to resist his argument. Jurors exchanged glances, their skepticism about her age dissolving in the face of consistency and observable alignment with evidence. Judge Ramirez, sensing the tension, intervened calmly. "Mr. Hayes, the court acknowledges your concerns. However, the witness's proximity to the event, coupled with repeated interaction with the trained K-9, supports the credibility of her testimony. We will proceed, ensuring questions are clear and concise to avoid undue stress on the child." Her words reinforced the seriousness with which Emma's observations were being treated, validating the unique circumstances that had allowed clarity to emerge. Linda Carter directed the questioning with precision. "Emma, can you show us where the bag went when the man dropped it?" The child pointed, tracing an invisible line from the table to a corner of the room. "It fell. Ranger sniffed, stayed there, barked when the man tried to reach it," she explained, mimicking the dog's movements with subtle gestures. Each motion illustrated a sequence previously misunderstood or ignored, and the jurors followed her lead, visualizing events in a way that words alone could not convey. Corinne Collins's heart pounded. She had long known Emma had an extraordinary memory, but witnessing it unfold with such authority in front of a room of adults, people trained to scrutinize, analyze, and question, was breathtaking. Her daughter's testimony was not just informative, it was transformative. It clarified confusion, resolved contradictions, and created a narrative that even the most skeptical juror could understand. Officer Brennan sat at the edge of his seat, eyes fixed on Ranger. The dog's calm yet attentive demeanor reinforced the testimony, serving as a silent witness to the events that Emma described. Every gesture, every bark, every pause was part of a larger story that had been previously obscured. The synergy between child and K-9 created a form of communication and observation that no adult witness could replicate, a triangulation of truth that was undeniable. Hayes attempted to regain momentum by calling adult witnesses back to the stand. "Can you confirm what you saw?" he asked. Their responses, however, were hesitant and inconsistent. One witness misremembered the direction of the suspect, another failed to recall the bag entirely, and a third contradicted their earlier statement. The disparity between adult accounts and Emma's precise testimony became increasingly apparent. Jurors, now leaning toward understanding the child's perspective, began to internalize the reliability of her observations. The security footage was replayed once again, this time in conjunction with Emma's gestures and narrative. Every moment she had described, the approach, the sniffing, the double nose tap, the dropped bag, appeared exactly as she had recounted. The courtroom collectively leaned forward, absorbing the alignment. Adults whispered among themselves, jurors exchanged subtle nods, and even Hayes's confident facade wavered. Emma's recall had illuminated details that had gone unnoticed for weeks, transforming a chaotic incident into a comprehensible sequence of events. Judge Ramirez paused, allowing the room a moment to absorb the significance of the testimony. "The court recognizes the unprecedented clarity provided by this young witness," she said. "The combination of trained K-9 behavior, child observation, and corroborating evidence provides a compelling account of the events." Her acknowledgement signaled to all present that the trial had entered its climactic phase. The alignment of truth, observation, and evidence was becoming indisputable. The jurors, long silent in their contemplation, began to show signs of consensus. Their body language shifted from curiosity and hesitation to engagement and understanding. They could see the sequence of events clearly, guided by Emma's account and Ranger's actions. The confusion that had plagued the trial, the conflicting adult testimony, overlooked details and misinterpretations, was unraveling before their eyes. The smallest witness in the room had become the linchpin for clarity. Corinne Collins whispered softly to herself, overwhelmed by a mixture of pride and relief. Her daughter, whom she had feared might be overwhelmed or misunderstood, was now the reason the jury could see the truth. Emma's honesty, meticulous memory, and fearless recounting of events had reshaped the narrative. In the courtroom, a child's perspective, once dismissed as trivial, had proven essential. The prosecution, sensing the growing momentum, attempted a final strategy. Hayes sought to discredit Ranger's signals, claiming that the dog's behavior could be coincidental. Yet when expert witnesses analyzed Ranger's movements, the double nose taps, and his response to the suspect's behavior, the explanation reinforced, rather than weakened, Emma's account. The triangulation of evidence was undeniable. Ranger acted precisely according to training, and Emma had observed and recalled those actions accurately. Emma, sensing the attention of the room, continued her narrative with poise. Then the man ran to the door. Ranger stayed, barked again. Then the police came, she said, gesturing to mark the final moments of the incident. Her words, simple yet precise, traced the culmination of the event, leaving the jury with a clear picture of the entire sequence. The story, once muddled and contradictory, now had coherence, clarity, and authority, largely thanks to the youngest witness in the courtroom. Corinne Collins allowed herself a quiet smile, seeing the impact of her daughter's courage. Emma had not only told the truth, she had clarified confusion, reconciled contradictions, and demonstrated the importance of attentive observation. The courtroom, once dominated by doubt and procedural disputes, now focused entirely on the narrative she provided. The trial had reached its climax, and the jurors were fully engaged, absorbing the unique synthesis of child observation, K-9 precision, and corroborating evidence. Officer Brennan, observing the culmination of Emma's testimony, felt a sense of profound validation. Weeks of scrutiny, misinterpretation, and professional doubt were now being resolved not by argument or conjecture, but by precise observation, memory, and execution. Ranger's calm presence had made Emma's recall possible, and together, they had illuminated the truth in a way that adults alone could not. The courtroom had witnessed a rare convergence of innocence, expertise, and clarity that left no room for ambiguity. As the day drew to a close, Judge Ramirez addressed the court. "We have observed an extraordinary example of truth emerging from the most unexpected source. The testimony of this young witness, corroborated by trained K-9 behavior and evidence, provides a level of clarity that is rare in cases of this nature. The court will consider all evidence carefully as deliberations proceed." Her words underscored the unprecedented nature of the trial and the pivotal role Emma had played in shaping understanding. The courtroom emptied slowly, leaving a palpable sense of awe and reflection. Jurors discussed quietly among themselves, reporters prepared to capture the story of a lifetime, and lawyers processed the dramatic shift in the trial's momentum. Ranger followed Officer Brennan out, maintaining the composure and vigilance that had characterized every moment. Corinne Collins knelt beside Emma, offering a gentle hug and whispering words of pride and encouragement. Emma's small voice, though simple, had reshaped the courtroom's understanding. Her observation, courage, and clarity had brought coherence to chaos, and in doing so, she had created a turning point in the trial. Adults, trained and experienced though they were, had seen firsthand the power of precise observation, trust, and honesty from the most unexpected source. By the time the lights dimmed, Part 7 marked the climax of the trial. The jury, previously uncertain, had begun to lean decisively toward understanding the events as they truly occurred. The narrative had shifted irreversibly. The combination of Emma's testimony, Ranger's actions, and corroborating evidence had crystallized a sequence of events that was no longer subject to doubt. And the courtroom had witnessed something extraordinary. A child's courage and clarity reshaping the pursuit of justice in real time. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the final day of the trial began. Every seat was filled. Jurors, Spectators, reporters, and legal staff waited for the moment that would determine the outcome of a case unlike any they had witnessed. The tension was thick, palpable, and unlike a typical trial. This was the culmination of a saga that had been shaped by an extraordinary partnership, a toddler and a police K-9. Emma Collins sat in her booster seat, clutching her stuffed puppy tightly, while Ranger remained beside her, calm, alert, and ready. Their quiet presence had already shifted the course of the proceedings, and today would finalize that transformation. Corinne Collins sat nervously in the gallery, glancing at her daughter every few moments. She had watched Emma captivate the courtroom over the previous days, and though she was immensely proud, she could not quell the flutter of worry in her chest. What if the jurors still doubted a 3-year-old's testimony? What if, despite all evidence, the prosecution's arguments prevailed? These thoughts ran through her mind as she tried to stay composed, but the sight of Emma's determined, innocent gaze brought her reassurance. The child had been brave beyond her years, and now she was about to witness the final act of the trial she had so profoundly influenced. Judge Ramirez called the court to order, her voice steady and authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have reached the point at which all evidence, testimony, and arguments have been presented. The jury will now deliberate and reach a verdict. I remind all parties that this case is unusual, but it is essential that each piece of testimony, regardless of the source, be given due consideration. Truth and accuracy, not expectation, must guide your decision." Her words resonated through the courtroom, emphasizing the extraordinary nature of the case and the responsibility resting on the jurors' shoulders. The jury filed out for deliberation, leaving the courtroom momentarily hushed. Reporters whispered among themselves, noting the unprecedented role of a toddler in guiding legal outcomes. Officer Brennan stood quietly, observing Ranger's calm stance beside Emma. His mind replayed every moment of the trial, the initial skepticism, the misinterpretations, the long hours of training with Ranger, and the quiet determination of a child whose observations had never wavered. What had begun as an ordinary case had become a testament to precision, trust, and the unexpected sources from which clarity can emerge. Inside the jury room, discussions were lively but measured. Jurors revisited the security footage, Emma's testimony, and the expert accounts of Ranger's behavior. They debated inconsistencies in adult recollections but found Emma's observations unwavering, precise, and corroborated by evidence. One juror remarked, "It's incredible how clearly she saw everything. She wasn't guessing. She knew what happened, and Ranger's actions confirmed it." Another nodded, "I've never seen testimony like this. It's so straightforward, so clear. The adults were confused, but she explained it perfectly." Minutes stretched into hours as the jury deliberated. The weight of the decision pressed heavily upon them. They understood that beyond the legal implications, this trial had demonstrated something rare: the importance of observation, honesty, and perspective from unexpected sources. Emma, though unaware of the full significance of her role, had become a symbol of clarity and truth. Ranger, trained and steady, had provided the consistent behavior necessary to validate her observations. Together, they had forged a narrative that the jurors could not ignore. Back in the courtroom, Corinne Collins tried to distract herself with small comforts, adjusting Emma's booster seat, smoothing the child's hair, and offering soft words of reassurance. Officer Brennan exchanged brief nods with Linda Carter, both aware that the hours of meticulous training, observation, and patience had led to this moment. The courtroom staff whispered quietly among themselves, reflecting on the unprecedented circumstances and the transformative nature of Emma's testimony. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the jury filed back into the courtroom. Their faces were solemn but resolved, carrying the weight of responsibility and the clarity that had emerged during deliberations. Judge Ramirez nodded at the foreperson. "Have you reached a verdict?" she asked, her voice steady but expectant. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with a calm but serious demeanor, rose. "Yes, Your Honor, we have reached a unanimous decision." She paused, ensuring the attention of everyone in the room. We find the defendant not guilty of all charges." A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. Corinne Collins exhaled sharply, tears forming in her eyes as relief and pride flooded her. Emma, too young to fully understand the legal implications, sensed the shift in energy and looked to Ranger, who wagged his tail ever so slightly in acknowledgement. The courtroom erupted in subdued applause and murmurs, recognizing the culmination of an extraordinary trial where truth had emerged in the most unexpected form. Prosecutor Hayes remained seated, his face tight with restrained frustration, while Linda Carter allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Officer Brennan approached Ranger, giving a quiet, congratulatory pat. "Good job, buddy," he murmured. The dog's calm demeanor reflected the steady patience that had carried them both through the chaos and complexity of the trial. Emma, sensing the joy around her, hugged her stuffed puppy tightly, her small face lighting up with a smile of pure innocence. Judge Ramirez addressed the courtroom, her tone measured and reflective. "This trial has been unprecedented in many ways. It has demonstrated the importance of careful observation, accurate recollection, and the willingness to consider truth from any source, no matter how unexpected. The court thanks all parties for their professionalism and care throughout these proceedings. Let this serve as a reminder that justice is built not only on procedure but on clarity, honesty, and attention to detail." Reporters clamored for interviews, eager to capture the story of the toddler and the police K-9 who had altered the course of justice. Cameras flashed as Corinne and Emma Collins were asked to recount their experience, though Emma's responses were limited to shy smiles and simple words. Yet even in those few moments, the world recognized her courage, her precision, and the extraordinary impact of her observations. Ranger, ever composed, remained a quiet companion, his presence reinforcing the lessons of discipline, training, and focus. Outside the courthouse, crowds had gathered, waiting to witness the aftermath. Neighbors, friends, and supporters approached Corinne and Emma, offering congratulations and marveling at the unusual circumstances. "I can't believe a 3-year-old remembered all of that," one spectator exclaimed. "And the dog, too, it's like something out of a storybook," said another. Corinne smiled, realizing that the community, like the courtroom, had come to recognize the extraordinary partnership that had shaped the trial. Back home, the Collins family reflected on the events that had unfolded. Dinner was quiet, a mix of relief and reflection filling the room. Corinne tucked Emma into bed, whispering softly, "You did something amazing today. You told the truth and everyone listened." Emma hugged her stuffed puppy tightly, murmuring, "Ranger helped." Corinne smiled, realizing that the child understood the partnership, even if she could not yet grasp the magnitude of its impact. Officer Brennan returned to the K-9 unit later that evening, reflecting on the extraordinary sequence of events. Ranger had performed flawlessly, guided by training and instinct, yet it was the child's observation that had brought the evidence to life. The case had demonstrated the value of patience, the importance of precise observation, and the power of unexpected collaboration. It was a lesson that would resonate with him, the police department, and the community for years to come. In the weeks that followed, Emma and Ranger received recognition from both the local community and national media. Stories highlighted the unusual but compelling role of a toddler in shaping a legal outcome. Officer Brennan was commended for his professionalism and the meticulous training that had allowed Ranger to respond so accurately. Corinne Collins was often asked to speak about the experience, sharing how trust, observation, and the partnership between a child and a K-9 could achieve something truly remarkable. The trial became a case study in law enforcement and legal circles, illustrating how unexpected witnesses and trained animals could provide clarity in complex situations. Emma, still young, remained blissfully unaware of the broader implications. To her, it had been about observing carefully, recounting honestly, and spending time with Ranger. But the world around her recognized a rare truth. Sometimes, the smallest voices can carry the most powerful insights. For the Collins family, life gradually returned to normal, though the extraordinary events of the trial would remain unforgettable. Emma continued to grow, her memory and observational skills increasingly remarkable. Ranger remained a trusted companion, their bond unbroken by the spotlight. And the courtroom, forever changed by their role, had learned a fundamental lesson. Justice is not solely the domain of experience or authority, but also of clarity, honesty, and courage, wherever it may come from, even from the most unexpected sources. As the sun set on the final day of the trial, Corinne Collins looked at Emma, who was playing quietly with Ranger at her feet. She realized that in guiding the course of justice, a child and a dog had shown the world the power of observation, patience, and trust. The courtroom had witnessed history, not through dramatic argument or legal maneuvering, but through the quiet, precise clarity of a tiny observer and a loyal K-9. And in that moment, Corinne understood that the true lesson of the trial extended far beyond the courtroom walls. Truth can emerge from the smallest and most unexpected of voices, and when it does, it can change everything.